So everybody's been introduced to me a little bit, so I'm just going to dive right in. In the brain theory section of the technical review, I want to present hypotheses about the brain that can be tested by achieving and working to achieve whole brain emulation. In the final write-up, I want to leave readers with the sense that though these are our hypotheses about the brain related to whole brain emulation, they are just that, hypotheses. They need to be and will be tested as research continues and are by no means guaranteed. The 2008, shoot. Sorry guys, I pulled up the wrong text. Okay, sorry, I'm still here. But what I'm going to present to you today is a little bit different. Today I'll present 5 questions that I hope to explore in the brain theory section and go through my very rough outline for what I've thought about discussing in relation to each question. This is actually one of the least developed sections of the technical review, so I was really hoping to embrace the idea of a workshop and get input for the audience regarding what I should write about for each question. I actually just recently changed my thinking on what this section will cover, so this is a very early rough draft. So like I said, I want to cover 5 questions. The first being, is brain activity computable? Second, how much do we need to understand about the brain in order to emulate it? What are the minimum requirements for emulating the brain? Do we need to emulate the body as well as the brain? And are you your connectome? So to begin, is brain activity computable? In the 2008 roadmap, it was assumed that brain activity is Turing computable, and if aspects of the brain are not Turing computable, they are not functionally relevant to behavior. But in the brain theory section, I want to take many steps back and explore basic questions like, what is computation? I think it would also be appropriate to briefly review topics related to philosophy of mind in this section. So I want to go into computational theories of mind, discuss the classical computational theory of mind, the Church-Turing thesis, and I'd like to explore any research that supports or refutes it. Hoping you guys can help me fill in these blanks. I also want to explore connectionism, which will probably include a brief discussion of artificial neural networks. A lot of these topics may actually be covered more in depth in some of the other sections, so that'll impact my decision making on how much to cover in this section. And of course, I'll go into computational neuroscience here. In fact, I want the bulk of this section to be a discussion of these approaches. Right now, I plan to cover predictive brain approaches like Bayesian brain theory, free energy theory, and of course explore Elias Smith and Anderson's neural engineering framework. What I'm hoping to do is cover this information and then form a coherent argument for what hypotheses we want to present as a team. So on to the next question. How much do we need to understand about the brain in order to emulate it? I thought this would be a good section to discuss philosophical arguments of organicism and reductionism, since these 2 ideas represent the extremes in answering that question. There seems to be a rich literature that describes limitations of reductionism in complex systems, so I think that would be important to explore here. The idea of building a model of a system based on its component parts actually automatically reminds me of artificial intelligence. From the little bit that I know about the topic, I know that they tend to build models using a vast database of fundamental units. I think I read about this in Kurzweil's book, How to Build a Mind, when he was describing his language recognition software. So I think exploring that area here would be informative. And of course, exploring realistic computational brain modeling. But these points seem to support reductionism, so of course I want to look at the other side. I think it'd be important to look at how the brain utilizes feedback loops and recurrent processing, how more abstract and higher processing levels can impact lower processing. For example, the visual system, I think I've seen a lot of research on how the cells in V1 can be impacted by higher levels in the visual system. Question: what are the minimum requirements for emulating the brain? I think this would be a good time to go into a review of complex systems and arguments of how the brain is a complex system and the principle of scale separation in those systems. I really don't know a lot of research here that would support, what level we need to emulate, but the roadmap did go into thinking that we need to do things like physiological mapping and that sort of thing. And the next question, do we need to emulate the body as well as the brain? Well, we know there's no effect on identity when a person receives a donated organ. You can replace your heart with the heart of another person, it would still be you. And I've also heard of a case study of a man who lacked all of abilities in proprioception. I think Sean Gallagher illustrated this in his book, How the Body Shapes the Mind. He had to use visual cues to completely relearn his motor skills, and there was no reported change in personality or behavior otherwise. But there are arguments for embodied consciousness, and I've seen about a pre-reflective self embedded in sensory motor perceptions as a way to explain subjective experience. So I think that would be an important thing to go through here as well. And Mark Solms actually discusses an idea of bodily self as a learned representation of self. That might be interesting to go into. I think there are several ideas kind of related to this that would be good to go into. And finally, are you your connectome? For this section, I want to review some of the research that supports the hypothesis that memories are stored in the connections between neurons. I specifically want to go into LTP and LTD encoding at glutamatergic synapses on dendritic spines. This seems to be something that Ken Hayworth is very excited about. But there are also some points about whether memory is related to identity. George Northoff has done some work looking at the cortical midline structures and their role in self-reflection. And these structures have also been found to relate to memory. And Antonio Damasio lists several neurological disorders like Alzheimer's that exemplify the importance of the posteromedial cortices in autobiographical memory and identity. So these are the types of things I'm hoping to go over in that section. So again, this is my very early draft of this section. I'd be really interested to hear about any questions or hypotheses you think should be included here, or any research that you think should be mentioned. But of course, I'm happy to answer any questions as well. And since I am moderating my own here, let me check to see if I have any questions online. Does anybody have any questions in person?
Thank you so much, Alicia. Thank you so much. And I don't know about everyone else here in the house, but I certainly have a couple of questions. So maybe we'll start with that, if you don't mind. We'll go into the house here. Let's see who else has a question first before I start blabbing. Yeah, Bill.
Go.
Did you want to talk right into the mic? That would help. Yeah.
Hey, Alicia. So you mentioned at one point, I think you called it the pre-reflective self. And I was just curious what you meant by that and what exactly that theory refers to.
I actually don't know too much about it. This is something I read about quite some time ago, but I thought it would be something that would be good to review here, which is why I mentioned it. Still doesn't look like there's any questions on the online.
Okay. So we have some more in-house questions, at least my questions, if no one else has questions. So I'll just dive in with a question I had. I like the list of fundamental questions or requirements and looking at those. But I'm wondering sometimes about the difference between what we might call in principle requirements or in principle theoretical underpinnings versus practical ones. So say, for example, the question about computational. Is the brain computational? Is brain function, is brain activity computational? And there are two sides to this. One side is, well, you know, if we knew the position and whatever trajectory of every atom in the universe or something like that, then perhaps everything is computational, and so is brain activity down to the, you know, the most precise detail. Now, of course, we may not need that precise detail. So then the question becomes, is the more abstract level computational? So that's already kind of you have to decide what you mean by computational or Turing computational at that point. And then there's also the question about what are we trying to compute? What are we trying to replicate? Is precisely replicating every aspect of a brain activity, every part of a behavior, is that important? Or how important is it? Because if you take any biological piece of neural tissue or any brain and you try to run the same input into it and see if it produces the same output, even that biological tissue itself will probably not produce exactly the same spatiotemporal spike trains, because there's a lot of noise, there are a lot of other influences that you just can't predict. So even the system itself can't reproduce or replicate its own behavior perfectly. So there's this, I don't know exactly how to capture this, but it's an important thing to get into when we're talking about the theory underlying brain emulation. And again, I think this ties into what we call the success criteria and the various success criteria for different purposes. And this difference between in principle versus practical, feasible. Did you want to say maybe a few words about how you think about that at the moment?
I really don't have an opinion on this. I intend to learn a lot when I'm writing this, so I was kind of hoping we could discuss more about what kind of discussion needs to go in here. I agree that what you're mentioning does need to be discussed in this section, but I'm really not sure what to say about it now.
So I'm not exactly sure whether, in your case, since you're the presenter at this moment, if I should be scouring the form for questions and answers, or if you've been doing that yourself.
I've been looking. It actually looks like Keith has a question of, do we want to suffer all the identity copy nonsense in this review? That's actually a good question. I've been thinking about that as well. I feel like that those topics have been really overdone, especially in the context of mind uploading and whole brain emulation. So I'd like to try to get away from that and really try to dig into, do we have any empirical evidence that points to one answer or the other? Looking at some other questions here. Here's one. Would context awareness studies in computer science help decide if we are just our connectome, or we also include the body or some more of our surrounding? Context awareness studies, I'm not terribly familiar with these. Randall, do you know much about these?
No, I'm afraid I don't know anything about context awareness studies.
That's interesting, though. I'll look into it. Thanks, Leslie. Another question from Keith. Is the document the right or wrong place to cover numerous theories of mind/consciousness, such as Penrose, Tononi? This is actually the direction I originally intended to take this section. But I'm not sure it's the direction we want to go. I'd love to hear anybody's thoughts on that. But, you know, again, this is really overdone, and I'm not sure they really get at the question about the feasibility of whole brain emulation. And I think that's where I want to go with this section. But I'd really like to hear if anybody has any thoughts on that, about the feasibility of whole brain emulation. And I think that's where I want to go with this section.
Yeah, so I do have an opinion about that. I think that we can't ever get away from that topic. The question of theories of consciousness comes up all the time. So one way or another, we have to talk about it. Although from the point of view of a tech review, it's difficult to tackle because there's just very little in terms of tech review that I think is doable. But maybe I'm wrong about that. But maybe instead of sticking that in the same topic, in the same chapter, same section of the review, we could have a separate bit that is specifically about questions about consciousness and theories about consciousness and different terminology that is used for different kinds of consciousness or thoughts on consciousness that people have. So I liked Michael Cerullo's paper on that, for example. Yeah, so yeah, that's my feeling about it.
Yeah, I agree. It seems odd if we didn't include them at all, didn't discuss it at all. And I think as carbon copies, it would be important for us to try to define these terms. I think that's one of the greatest weaknesses in consciousness research is that we have all these terms that we throw around, and I think we all think we know what we're saying, but we could really use some better definitions. And maybe that's a good thing for carbon copies to jump in on to try to, I don't know, standardize that. I'm just looking at the online Q&A. Do we have any in-house comments?
If you don't find a lot more Q&A at some point, I mean, keep going if you want to. I'm just saying if you end up saying, well, okay, this is about it for this topic, it's not a problem to put in a break because we have a little coffee break planned. There's a slide for that and everything. And then I'll announce that there's going to be another session after this. So I'll just let you finish up, of course.
No, I think now would be a good time. I'm not seeing many other questions.
Okay. In that case, I'll just address the audience out there. We're going to do a short coffee break. You'll see that it'll say on the slide that we're coming back at around 5 p.m. That's when the next session is due. That last session is our special topic on discovering neural circuits in brain data. And we have 2 more speakers for that. So we have Diana Deca and Mikhail Lebedev coming up. So we'll see you all again at 5. Thanks.